Sangley Point Naval Base, the Philippines, March 1942. The warm tropical air hung heavy over the abandoned American facility as Japanese naval engineers moved through the debris-scattered grounds. They'd taken Manila Bay weeks earlier, and now teams were cataloguing everything the retreating Americans had left behind. Aircraft parts, fuel drums, damaged fighters, standard occupation work. Then, someone found the warehouse near the seaplane hangar. Inside, lined up in wooden cradles, sat 6 Mark 13 aerial torpedoes. Intact, complete with technical documentation still in their storage crates. For the engineers from Yokosuka Naval Arsenal, this wasn't just salvage, this was intelligence, a chance to examine the weapon that American torpedo bombers had been dropping against Japanese ships since the war began. A chance to understand what they were really up against. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The recovery team worked carefully. These torpedoes represented American aerial torpedo technology in its entirety. The Mark 13 was the only purpose-built aircraft torpedo the United States Navy had. Everything American torpedo bombers carried into combat, every attack on Japanese carriers, every strike against cruisers and transports. This weapon, they photographed everything before moving a single component. Serial numbers, markings, the condition of each torpedo. Then they began the delicate work of preparing them for shipment back to Japan. By April, all 6 torpedoes were aboard a transport heading for Yokosuka, where Japan's best minds in torpedo technology waited to tear them apart. The context here matters enormously. In early 1942, Japanese naval aviation dominated the Pacific. The attack on Pearl Harbor 7 months earlier had demonstrated Japanese torpedo warfare at its absolute peak. 40 Nakajima B-5N Kate bombers had struck Battleship Row with Type 91 aerial torpedoes, sinking or crippling 4 American battleships. 3 days later, Type 91 torpedoes dropped from land-based bombers had sent HMS Prince of Wales and HMS Repulse to the bottom off Malaya, 2 modern capital ships sunk by aerial torpedoes in open water. The Japanese had spent over a decade perfecting aerial torpedo technology. Their Type 91 was arguably the most sophisticated aerial torpedo in the world. It could be dropped from higher altitudes and at higher speeds than any comparable weapon. It used an advanced gyroscopic anti-roll system that kept the torpedo stable during the chaos of water entry. It employed wooden tail stabilizers that broke away cleanly when the weapon hit the sea. Every technical challenge that made aerial torpedoes notoriously difficult to use had been systematically solved. American torpedo performance, by contrast, had been disastrous. At the Battle of Midway, in June 1942, just 3 months after the Sangley Point capture, 41 American torpedo bombers would attack the Japanese carrier fleet. 39 would be shot down. Not a single torpedo would hit its target. The weapons either ran too deep, porpoised on the surface, or simply failed to run at all after release. Japanese pilots returning from combat in early 1942 reported that American torpedo attacks were almost suicidal. The Douglas TBD Devastator torpedo bombers came in low and slow, making them easy targets for both fighters and anti-aircraft fire. And even when they survived long enough to drop their weapons, the torpedoes frequently malfunctioned. From a Japanese perspective, American aerial torpedo technology appeared to be a generation behind. So when those 6 Mark 13s arrived at Yokosuka Naval Arsenal in April 1942, the engineering team approached them with professional curiosity mixed with a certain degree of confidence. They knew their own Type 91 was excellent. They'd seen it perform in combat. Now they would see exactly how far behind the Americans really were. The Yokosuka Naval Arsenal sat on the western shore of Tokyo Bay, just south of Yokohama. It had been Japan's primary naval research and development facility since the Meiji era. The arsenal's first air technical research arsenal handled all aircraft-related projects, including torpedo development. By 1942, it employed hundreds of engineers and technicians, many of whom had worked on the Type 91 program. The facility had a systematic process for evaluating captured weapons, photograph everything in original condition, disassemble carefully, documenting each step, measure every component, test materials, analyze design choices, compare to Japanese equivalents. The goal wasn't just to understand what the enemy had built, but why they'd built it that way. The Mark 13 torpedoes were moved into a secure examination building. The team assigned to the project included some of Japan's most experienced torpedo engineers. Several had worked directly on Type 91 development. Others specialized in propulsion systems, guidance mechanisms, or warhead design. Everyone involved understood that this evaluation might reveal vulnerabilities in American weapons that could be exploited tactically. The initial visual inspection took several days. The engineers walked around the torpedoes, making notes, taking measurements, comparing them to photographs of Type 91 weapons laid out nearby for reference. The contrast was immediately apparent. The Mark 13 was short and fat, 22.5 inches in diameter, only 13 feet 5 inches long. It looked stubby, almost crude compared to the more elegant proportions of the Type 91. The Type 91 measured 18 inches in diameter and just over 18 feet long. The dimension difference reflected fundamentally different design philosophies. The Japanese had prioritized making their torpedo as streamlined as possible while maintaining adequate warhead size. The Americans had apparently decided that a shorter, fatter weapon was acceptable if it meant easier aircraft carriage. Weight told a similar story. The Mark 13 weighed roughly 1,950 pounds in its early variants. The Type 91 weighed 1,841 pounds. Not a huge difference, but the American torpedo was heavier while being shorter. That suggested less sophisticated weight distribution or possibly heavier structural components. When the engineering team began detailed disassembly, their initial impressions were confirmed. The Mark 13's construction was straightforward, robust, certainly, but not particularly refined. The torpedo used a wet heater steam turbine for propulsion. Alcohol fuel burned with compressed air, heating water to create steam that drove a turbine. This was conventional technology, reliable but not advanced. The Type 91 used the same basic system. The guidance system on the Mark 13 was equally conventional. A Mark 12 mod, one gyroscope, provided directional stability. A depth mechanism controlled running depth using a bellows and pendulum system. These were standard torpedo control technologies that had been in use since World War I. The Japanese Type 91 used similar basic components, but with significantly more sophisticated refinements. If you're finding this technical deep dive fascinating, take a moment to like this video and share it with any history enthusiasts you know. The tail section revealed the most interesting features. The Mark 13 used a 4-blade propeller mounted behind conventional rudders and elevators. Nothing unusual there. But the team noted that early Mark 13s had suffered from tail section damage during water entry. American engineers had tried various solutions. Some torpedoes had been fitted with wooden box tails. Others used metal shrouds around the tail fins. The engineers photographed these modifications carefully. The wooden box tail concept was familiar. The Type 91 had pioneered detachable wooden tail stabilizers back in 1936. The Americans appeared to be implementing similar ideas, but years later, and with less sophistication, the Japanese wooden tails were precisely engineered to shed cleanly upon water entry while providing maximum stabilization during the aerial drop phase. The American versions looked cruder, heavier, less aerodynamically refined. Then the team examined the nose section and warhead. The Mark 13 carried a Mark 4 contact exploder and initially a warhead containing 404 pounds of TNT. Later versions would use 600 pounds of the more powerful Torpex explosive. The Type 91, depending on the model, carried warheads ranging from 213.5 to 526 kilograms. The American explosive load was comparable, perhaps slightly larger, but the exploder design revealed something interesting. The Mark 13 used only a contact exploder. no magnetic influence feature. The Japanese had experimented with magnetic exploders, but found them unreliable. The Americans apparently had reached the same conclusion, or perhaps had never developed magnetic influence exploders for aerial torpedoes in the first place. This was actually somewhat puzzling to the Japanese engineers. American submarine torpedoes, they knew from intelligence reports, did use magnetic influence exploders. Why not aerial torpedoes? The most likely explanation was that aerial torpedo development and submarine torpedo development had followed separate paths in the American system, with little communication between programs. Testing components from the disassembled Mark 13s confirmed the initial assessment. Materials were good quality. American steel and aluminum alloys were excellent. Manufacturing standards were high. The torpedoes were well built. But the design itself appeared dated. There was nothing in the Mark 13 that represented a technical advance over existing Japanese technology. If anything, it seemed a step behind. The propulsion system testing was particularly revealing. The Mark 13's wet heater engine produced adequate power, but it was conventional in every respect. Maximum speed in the water was 33.5 knots. Range at that speed was approximately 6,300 yards. The Type 91 could reach 42 knots with a range of 2,000 meters, or run slower for greater range depending on the model and settings. Speed and range comparisons were tricky because the weapons served slightly different tactical doctrines. But what struck the Japanese engineers was that the American torpedo had no performance advantage. It wasn't faster. It didn't have greater range, the warhead wasn't notably larger, and the guidance system wasn't more sophisticated. Where the Mark 13 really fell short was in launch parameters. This was the critical measure of an aerial torpedo's effectiveness. The Type 91 Mod 2, which had been used at Pearl Harbor, could be dropped at speeds up to 330 km per hour from altitudes as low as 20 meters. In power dive attacks, it could handle release at the maximum speed of a Kate bomber, 378 km per hour. The Mark 13, according to the American technical documentation recovered with the torpedoes, had to be dropped at speeds below 110 knots and from altitudes under 150 feet. Those were crippling restrictions. They forced American torpedo bombers to slow down and descend into the teeth of defensive fire before release. That explained the horrific casualties American torpedo squadrons were suffering. But why were the launch parameters so restrictive? The disassembly revealed the answer. The Mark 13's structure simply wasn't strong enough to handle high-speed water impact. The tail section was prone to damage. Internal components could shift or break under extreme deceleration forces. The torpedo hadn't been designed with robust enough construction to survive aggressive launch profiles. The Japanese engineers documented all of this in their reports. The technical evaluation was professional and thorough, but the conclusion was unavoidable. The American Mark 13 aerial torpedo was inferior to the Japanese Type 91 in nearly every measurable way. It had more restrictive launch parameters. It offered no performance advantages. Its design appeared to be based on older concepts, implemented without the sophisticated refinements Japan had developed. One engineer, reviewing the assembled evidence, made a note in the margin of his report. The Americans, he wrote, appeared to have little serious intention of developing advanced aerial torpedo technology. They seemed content with a weapon that worked adequately, without pushing for the kind of technical excellence that Japanese engineers pursued as a matter of professional pride. This assessment wasn't arrogance. It was based on hard evidence. The Mark 13 sitting disassembled in the Yokosuka examination room was simply not a cutting-edge weapon. It was competent, functional, but dated. The Americans had apparently designed it in the mid-1930s and then failed to improve it significantly. The Japanese, by contrast, had been continuously refining the Type 91 since its introduction in 1931. Mod 1 added wooden stabilizers in 1936. Mod 2 introduced the sophisticated anti-roll system in 1941. Development was ongoing. The Type 91 kept getting better. If the Americans were following a similar development path with the Mark 13, there was no evidence of it in the captured examples. These appeared to be early production models, and they didn't show signs of the kind of iterative improvement that characterized Japanese torpedo development. The most damning evidence came from comparing the anti-roll systems. This was where Japanese engineering truly excelled. The Type 91 Mod 2 used a gyroscopically controlled system that actively prevented the torpedo from rolling during water entry. Small control surfaces near the tail, controlled by dedicated gyroscopes, sensed rotation and countered it instantly. As the torpedo approached the neutral position, the system even employed counter-steering to prevent overshoot. This was sophisticated proportional control, far ahead of its time. The Mark 13 had no active anti-roll system, nothing. It relied entirely on passive stabilization from its wooden tail attachments and careful drop technique. If the torpedo entered the water at an angle that induced roll, there was no active correction. It either sorted itself out through hydrodynamics, or it didn't. This explained why American pilots had to be so careful about drop parameters. They were trying to ensure perfect water entry through precise flying, because their torpedoes couldn't compensate for imperfect drops the way Japanese torpedoes could. It was like comparing a modern aircraft with fly-by-wire stability augmentation to an older design requiring constant pilot input to stay stable. The Yokosuka team compiled their findings into a comprehensive technical report. The document ran to several hundred pages, with detailed photographs, technical drawings, materials analysis, and comparative assessments. Copies went to the Naval General Staff, to Carrier Air Group commanders, to other technical arsenals. The message was clear. American aerial torpedo technology posed no particular threat. The Type 91 was superior. Japanese torpedo bomber crews could be confident that their weapons represented the state of the art. There was one item in the report that would prove prophetic, though nobody recognized it at the time. One of the junior engineers noted that the Americans appeared to have adopted wooden tail stabilizers similar to Japan's design. He wrote that imitation was the highest form of flattery, and that the Americans had obviously recognized the superiority of the Japanese approach. They were trying to copy it, albeit crudely. What this engineer couldn't know was that the wooden tail stabilizers represented just the beginning of a transformation. The Americans weren't simply copying Japanese ideas. They were learning, adapting, and they were about to embark on the most intensive torpedo development program of the war, one that would turn the despised Mark 13 into the most lethal aerial torpedo any nation ever fielded. But in April 1942, standing in the examination room at Yokosuka, looking at the disassembled American torpedo, the Japanese engineers had every reason to feel confident. Their assessment was accurate based on the evidence before them. The Mark 13 was inferior, primitive, even, by comparison to what Japan had achieved. They filed their report and moved on to other projects. The Type 91 continued its excellent combat record. Japanese torpedo bombers continued to dominate wherever they operated, and the 6 captured Mark 13s were eventually stored away, their secrets extracted, their threat assessed and dismissed. What the Japanese engineers couldn't see was the crisis unfolding in American naval aviation. The disastrous performance at Midway would force a reckoning, the horrific casualties in torpedo squadrons would demand action, and American industry, American engineering, and American determination would combine to solve problems that the Newport Torpedo Station had been content to ignore for a decade. The Japanese were right about what the Mark 13 was in 1942, a flawed, outdated weapon that killed American aviators as surely as Japanese fighters did. What they couldn't predict was what the Mark 13 would become, and by the time they realized their mistake, it would be far too late to matter. The Battle of Midway changed everything. June 4, 1942, 41 American torpedo bombers attacked the Japanese carrier fleet. 15 Douglas TBD, Devastators from Hornet, 14 from Enterprise, 12 from Yorktown. They came in low and slow, exactly as doctrine demanded, carrying Mark 13 torpedoes that required gentle handling. Japanese Zero fighters slaughtered them. Anti-aircraft fire from the screening destroyers tore through the formations. Of the 41 torpedo bombers that attacked, only 6 returned. 35 aircraft lost, 80% casualties, and not a single torpedo hit its target. Not one. The most one-sided massacre in naval aviation history, and it accomplished absolutely nothing. The survivors told horrific stories. Ensign George Gay, the sole survivor from Torpedo 8, watched his entire squadron die around him. Lieutenant Commander John Waldron, leading Torpedo 8, pressed the attack even as Zeros picked off his planes one by one. He went down with his squadron. Lieutenant Commander Eugene Lindsay from Torpedo 6 never made it home. Neither did Lieutenant Commander Lance Massey from Torpedo 3. The torpedo squadrons had done their job. They'd forced the Japanese carriers to maneuver, disrupting flight operations, setting up the dive bombers for their devastating attack. But the cost was unbearable, and the Mark 13 torpedoes, the weapons these men died delivering, had failed completely. In the aftermath, the United States Navy could no longer ignore what frontline aviators had been reporting since Pearl Harbor. The Mark 13 was a death trap, not just because it forced slow, low approaches, but because even when crews survived to drop their weapons, the WWII torpedoes didn't work. Analysis of 105 Mark 13 drops in mid-1943 painted a damning picture. 36% ran cold. The engine simply didn't start. 20% sank immediately upon water entry. 20% had poor deflection performance, veering off course. 18% ran at the wrong depth. 2% ran on the surface, advertising their presence. Only 31% gave a satisfactory run. 69% failure rate. 69%. The problem wasn't new. VT6 had conducted training exercises in July 1941, almost a year before Midway. They dropped 10 Mark 13 torpedoes. 1 ran properly, 1 out of 10. 4 sank and couldn't be recovered. 5 ran erratically. The Navy had known. They'd known for a year before the war even started that the Mark 13 was fundamentally broken. But the Bureau of Ordnance at the Newport Torpedo Station in Rhode Island had insisted there was nothing wrong with the weapon. The problem, they said, was operator error. Pilots weren't following procedures correctly. Maintenance crews weren't assembling the torpedoes properly. The torpedo itself was fine. This was the same Bureau of Ordnance that would spend 2 years denying that submarine torpedoes had depth-keeping problems, magnetic exploder failures, and contact exploder defects. The same organization that had designed and built the Mark 13 in the first place and had every institutional incentive to defend their work. The Newport Torpedo Station was a bureaucratic disaster, staffed by civilian employees with civil service protection, producing perhaps 50 torpedoes per month when wartime requirements were 1,500, using hand-fitting techniques more appropriate to building custom rifles than mass-producing weapons. Testing was minimal because test firings destroyed expensive torpedoes, and the budget came from the same pool that paid salaries. After Midway, the Navy finally bypassed Bureau of Ordnance entirely. They turned to the National Defense Research Committee, a civilian scientific organization that had been established to mobilize American technical expertise for the war effort. The NDRC assigned the problem to the California Institute of Technology. "Give us the Mark 13, Caltech said. "We'll fix it." The Caltech team approached the problem the way the Newport Torpedo Station never had. Through actual scientific testing, they built a 300-foot pneumatic launch ramp on Morris Dam in California. They could fire full-size Mark 13 torpedoes down this ramp at controlled speeds and angles, launching them into the crystal-clear water of a mountain reservoir. High-speed cameras captured every millisecond of water entry, every impact, every splash, every structural failure. What they discovered invalidated a decade of Bureau of Ordnance assumptions. The low and slow doctrine that was getting aviators killed was actually making things worse. When a Mark 13 dropped at low speed from low altitude, it hit the water at a shallow angle. The torpedo's afterbody slapped the surface, transmitting enormous shock loads through the structure. Internal components shifted, tail fins bent, mechanisms jammed. Higher, faster drops were actually better. Dropping from several hundred feet at higher speeds gave the torpedo time to stabilize in the air before water entry. The angle of impact was steeper, more controlled. The torpedo plunged nose first rather than belly flopping. As long as the structure could handle the impact forces, everything worked better. So Caltech reinforced the structure. They developed drag rings, cylindrical shrouds around the nose that slowed the torpedo in flight and cushioned water impact. They created shroud rings around the tail fins, reinforcing them against damage. They tested wooden box tails, similar to what the Japanese used, but engineered to American manufacturing standards, optimized for the Mark 13's specific hydrodynamics. 4,300 test drops. 4,300 torpedoes launched into that reservoir. Every variable tested, every failure mode analyzed, every component that broke was redesigned, strengthened, refined, and tested again. This was engineering the way it was supposed to be done, the way the Newport torpedo station had never done it. And it worked. By mid-1944, the modified Mark 13 could be dropped from 800 feet at 260 knots. By early 1945, some drops succeeded from altitudes between 5,000 and 7,000 feet. 5 out of 6 ran hot, straight, and normal. The failure rate had been reduced from 69% to under 20%. And as pilots gained confidence in the weapon, tactics evolved to exploit its new capabilities. The shroud rings were particularly elegant. Metal reinforcements around the tail fins that the Japanese engineers had dismissed as crude improvisation turned out to be brilliantly effective. They eliminated hooking, the tendency of the torpedo to veer sideways in the water. They prevented broaching when the torpedo porpoised on the surface. Hot, straight, and normal runs approached 100% reliability. The wooden box tail, that feature the Japanese had invented in 1936 and the Americans had copied, underwent continuous refinement. American engineers tested different woods, different breakaway mechanisms, different aerodynamic profiles. The final design was probably better than the Japanese original, more consistent, more reliable, optimized specifically for the Mark 13's weight and dimensions. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. But the technical improvements alone don't explain what happened next. The Mark 13 became devastating, because it arrived in the hands of better-trained pilots, flying better aircraft with better tactics, supported by overwhelming American industrial production. The Grumman TBF Avenger replaced the obsolete Devastator as America's standard torpedo bomber. Bigger, faster, tougher. It could carry the improved Mark 13 while also hauling depth charges, bombs, or rockets. It mounted defensive guns. It had armor. It could take damage and keep flying. The contrast with the Devastator was night and day. Pilot training improved dramatically. By 1944, American torpedo bomber pilots were receiving over 300 hours of flight training before reaching combat squadrons. They practiced with the improved Mark 13 until 4 rounds per minute became muscle memory. They learned to coordinate with dive bombers and fighters for mutually supporting attacks. American radar technology gave torpedo bombers another critical advantage. By late 1944, TBF Avengers carried radar sets that provided precise range to target, no more guessing distance by eye while under fire. The radar told them exactly when to drop for optimal torpedo run. This eliminated one of the biggest variables in torpedo attack, and American industry produced Mark 13s in quantities Japan couldn't match. Total production reached 17,000 torpedoes, 17,000, enough to equip every carrier air group, every land-based patrol squadron, even PT boats in the South Pacific. When American forces needed aerial torpedoes, they had them, plenty of them. The Japanese, meanwhile, were running out of everything: trained pilots, fuel, ships to operate from. The Battle of the Philippine Sea, in June 1944, the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, destroyed Japanese carrier aviation as an effective force. The few remaining experienced pilots were dying in battles Japan couldn't win. Replacements barely knew how to fly, let alone execute sophisticated torpedo attacks. The Type 91 aerial torpedo remained an excellent weapon throughout the war. Its technical sophistication hadn't diminished, but excellence in torpedo design didn't matter when there were no trained pilots to deliver them, no carriers to launch from, no fuel to power the bombers. Japan's superior torpedo technology became irrelevant in the face of American material and industrial dominance. The reversal of fortunes was complete. October 24, 1944, the Battle of Leyte Gulf. TBF Avengers from multiple carrier groups attacked the Japanese super battleship Musashi as she steamed toward the landing beaches. Wave after wave of torpedo bombers. They dropped improved Mark 13s from altitudes and speeds that would have been impossible 2 years earlier. The torpedoes ran hot, straight, and normal. Musashi absorbed an incredible amount of punishment, 11 torpedo hits, perhaps more. The exact count is disputed because so many torpedoes struck home, but the Mark 13s ripped open her hull below the waterline. Flooding overwhelmed the damage control parties. The largest battleship ever built at that point in history capsized and sank, taking over 1,000 men with her. 6 months later, April 7, 1945. The super battleship Yamato, Musashi's sister ship, sortied on a one-way mission to beach herself at Okinawa and fight as an immobile fortress. She never made it. American carrier aircraft found her in the East China Sea. 380 aircraft attacked in waves. The TBF Avengers came in from multiple directions, coordinated attacks that split defensive fire and made evasion impossible. The Mark 13s worked perfectly. 10 torpedo hits, possibly more, 5 bomb hits for good measure. Yamato rolled over and exploded, torn apart by her own magazine detonations. The most powerful battleship ever built, destroyed by the weapon Japanese engineers had dismissed as primitive just 3 years earlier. The numbers tell the story. American carrier aircraft sank or helped sink both Japanese super battleships. They crippled or destroyed multiple fleet carriers. They devastated cruiser and destroyer formations. And the Mark 13 aerial torpedo, the weapon that had failed so catastrophically at Midway, had become the most effective ship killer in the American arsenal. By war's end, naval historians would call the improved Mark 13 the best aerial torpedo of World War II, better than the British Mark 15, better than the German designs, and yes, better than the Japanese Type 91, not because of any single technical feature, but because American engineering had solved every practical problem that limited torpedo effectiveness. The Type 91 remained superior in some purely technical measures. Its anti-roll system was more sophisticated, its gyroscopic controls were more advanced. Japanese engineering had achieved remarkable things within their resource constraints, but the Mark 13 had become reliable, dead reliable, and reliability mattered more than sophistication when you needed to sink enemy warships. There's a broader lesson here about how technologies succeed or fail in wartime. The Japanese engineers at Yokosuka in 1942 weren't wrong in their assessment. The Mark 13 they examined was inferior, primitive even. Their technical analysis was accurate, but they made a critical error. They assumed that what they were seeing represented the limit of American capability, that the United States Navy would remain content with an inadequate weapon. They didn't account for American industrial might. They didn't anticipate the willingness to bypass bureaucratic obstacles and bring in outside expertise. They couldn't predict that Caltech scientists would fire 4,000 torpedoes into a reservoir just to understand water entry dynamics. Most importantly, they didn't recognize that America's decentralized, innovative engineering culture could solve problems faster than Japan's more rigid system. The Japanese had spent a decade perfecting the Type 91 through careful, systematic improvement. It was excellent work. But when the Mark 13 needed fixing, the Americans brought overwhelming resources to bear and solved the problem in less than 2 years. Different systems, different approaches, And in this case, the American approach won. The torpedo itself tells another part of the story. Even after all the improvements, the Mark 13 remained essentially the same weapon, same basic dimensions, same propulsion system, same guidance mechanisms. What changed was everything around it. The tail stabilizers, the nose drag rings, the shroud reinforcements, the drop parameters, the training, the tactics. The Japanese had built a sophisticated torpedo and then tried to maintain that edge through incremental refinement. The Americans had built an adequate torpedo, watched it fail catastrophically, and then threw every available resource at fixing it. Both approaches can work, but the American approach scaled better when the problem became urgent and resources were essentially unlimited. There's also the human factor. Those American torpedo bomber crews at Midway had died for nothing. Their torpedoes failed them, their doctrine failed them, their equipment failed them, and someone in the American system decided that was unacceptable, that the men risking their lives deserved weapons that actually worked. The Caltech program, the 4,000 test drops, the complete redesign of launch parameters, that was all done with those dead aviators in mind. The Japanese system, for all its technical excellence, didn't show the same urgency. The Type 91 worked well enough. Combat losses were acceptable by military standards. There was no crisis that demanded radical change. So the torpedo continued as it was, gradually becoming less relevant as the strategic situation deteriorated. By 1945, the Mark 13 had been adapted for uses its original designers never imagined. PT boats in the South Pacific stripped out their torpedo tubes and just rolled Mark 13s off deck racks, saving weight and eliminating the dangerous flare of burning grease from tube launches. The airdrop capability made this possible. Nobody had planned for it, but American engineers recognized an opportunity and exploited it. The Mark 13 even saw service after World War II, Korean War, 1951. North Korean forces were using the Hwachon Dam to control water levels downstream, hindering United Nations ground operations. 8 AD, 4 Skyraider attack aircraft from USS Princeton flew a mission to destroy the dam. They carried Mark 13 torpedoes, the only weapons capable of delivering enough explosive power underwater to breach the structure. 6 of the 8 torpedoes ran perfectly. Decades after its design, years after the improvements that saved it from obsolescence, the Mark 13 was still getting the job done. It would be the last aerial torpedo attack in U.S. Navy history, a fitting end for a weapon that had travelled from disaster to triumph. The Japanese engineers who examined those captured Mark 13s at Yokosuka never wrote a follow-up report. There was no reassessment after the war turned. No acknowledgement that their initial conclusions, while technically accurate, had missed the larger picture. Most of those engineers probably didn't survive the war. Yokosuka Naval Arsenal was heavily bombed in 1945. Records were destroyed, personnel scattered. But if any of them had survived to see what the Mark 13 became, what would they have thought? Would they have recognized that they'd been evaluating a weapon at its worst moment, just before the transformation that would make it deadly? Would they have understood that American engineering, when properly motivated and resourced, could overcome problems that seemed insurmountable, or would they have simply noted the irony? That the primitive American torpedo they'd dismissed had gone on to sink their Navy's greatest warships, that the wooden tail stabilizers they'd invented, which the Americans had copied so crudely, had become part of a weapon system that would help destroy the Imperial Japanese Navy. The captured Mark 13 torpedoes at Yokosuka told a story, but it was the wrong story. Or rather, it was only the beginning of a story that Japanese engineers never got to finish reading. By 1943, as American torpedo bombers began appearing over Japanese-held waters with distressing regularity, some officers must have started noticing changes. The attacks looked different. TBF Avengers came in higher, faster. They dropped their torpedoes with confidence that hadn't existed a year earlier, and increasingly, those torpedoes hit their targets. There's no evidence that Japanese technical intelligence ever captured and examined the improved Mark 13 variants, the ones with drag rings, shroud rings, and perfected wooden tails. By the time those weapons were in widespread use, Japan was losing territory, not capturing it. The opportunities for detailed examination that existed in early 1942 were gone, so Japanese naval aviation fought the rest of the war never quite understanding what had changed. They knew American torpedo attacks had become more effective. Combat reports documented hits that simply hadn't occurred in 1942. But without access to the actual hardware, without the technical intelligence that might have explained the transformation, they could only guess at causes. Some Japanese officers attributed the change to improved American pilot training. This was partially true. Others credited better tactics and coordination. Also true, a few recognized that American aircraft had gotten better, that the TBF Avenger was a far more capable platform than the TBD Devastator. All of these factors mattered, but none of them captured the fundamental truth. The Americans had fixed their torpedo. The strategic implications were devastating. Japan had entered the war with arguably the best aerial torpedo in the world and doctrine that maximized its effectiveness. For 6 months, Japanese torpedo bombers had dominated whenever they operated. Then, slowly at first, and then with gathering momentum, that advantage evaporated. Not because Japanese torpedoes got worse, but because American torpedoes got dramatically better. Material superiority decided the Pacific War, and torpedoes were just one small piece of that larger pattern. American industry produced aircraft faster than Japan could shoot them down. American shipyards launched carriers faster than Japanese submarines could sink them, and American engineering solved technical problems faster than Japanese research could develop counters. The Mark 13 story captures this dynamic perfectly. Early war, American weapons fail catastrophically, while the Japanese equivalent performs brilliantly. Mid-war, massive American engineering effort transforms the failing weapon into something effective. Late war, improved American weapons help destroy the Japanese fleet, while superior Japanese technology becomes irrelevant due to pilot losses, fuel shortages, and strategic collapse. It's worth noting what didn't save Japan. Technical excellence didn't save them. Tactical innovation didn't save them. Japanese naval aviation developed increasingly desperate tactics, including kamikaze attacks, that demonstrated terrible creativity in the face of certain defeat. Courage certainly didn't save them. Japanese aircrews pressed home attacks against impossible odds until there were simply no experienced crews left. What Japan lacked was the industrial depth to sustain losses while developing solutions. Factories were being bombed, materials were scarce, and technical personnel were stretched impossibly thin. The Americans had the opposite problem. Too many resources, almost. Multiple competing torpedo development programs, Caltech working on the Mark 13. Other teams are developing the Mark 25 as a potential replacement. Acoustic homing torpedoes for anti-submarine work. The luxury of having enough industrial capacity that you could pursue multiple solutions simultaneously and see which one worked best. Thank you for reading. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe. Yamato's sinking on April 7, 1945, stands as the final punctuation mark on this story. The most powerful battleship ever built, destroyed by aircraft carrying torpedoes that 3 years earlier couldn't hit a stationary target. The historical irony is almost too perfect. Japanese engineers had examined American torpedoes, found them wanting, and filed reports confirming Japanese technical superiority. Then American engineers fixed the problems, and the improved weapon helped send Japanese superiority to the bottom of the Pacific. The Mark 13 served until 1951, a remarkable service life for any weapon system. Its final combat use, destroying that Korean dam, demonstrated that even years after the improvements that saved it, the weapon remained effective. Not because it was the most sophisticated, but because it was reliable, producible, and good enough. Good enough, is sometimes the most important specification in military hardware. Not the best, not the most advanced, just good enough to get the job done, and reliable enough that crews trust it. The Mark 13 became that weapon. But paper specifications don't sink battleships. Reliable weapons in the hands of well-trained crews with air superiority and unlimited industrial support sink battleships. There's a final irony to consider. Those wooden tail stabilizers that American engineers adopted and from Japanese designs became one of the Mark 13's most important features. The Japanese had invented them in 1936 for the Type 91. American engineers captured examples, studied them, and adapted the concept for the Mark 13. Then they improved on the original design through systematic testing. So, in a sense, Japanese innovation did contribute to the Mark 13's success, just not in the way Japanese engineers intended. They'd created a superior torpedo and assumed that superiority would be permanent. Instead, the Americans learned from Japanese innovations, combined them with their own engineering approaches, and created something that ultimately proved more effective in the operational environment that mattered, the Pacific War, from 1943 to 1945. That's perhaps the hardest lesson from this story. Technical superiority at one moment doesn't guarantee strategic success over time. The better weapon is the one that wins the war, not the one with more sophisticated gyroscopes. And winning the war requires more than just good design. It requires industrial capacity, engineering flexibility, training systems, tactical doctrine, and the willingness to admit when something isn't working and fix it, regardless of bureaucratic obstacles. The Japanese engineers at Yokosuka in 1942 did their jobs professionally. Their assessment was accurate based on available evidence. The Mark 13 they examined was inferior. They couldn't predict what it would become, because they couldn't predict the massive engineering effort that would transform it. That failure of imagination, more than any technical shortcoming, may have been their most significant error. In war, sometimes the side that recognizes its problems and fixes them defeats the side that starts with advantages and assumes they'll last forever. The Mark 13's journey from disaster to triumph stands as testament to that principle. And, somewhere in the Pacific, scattered across the seabed at the final resting places of Musashi and Yamato, lie the consequences of underestimating American industrial engineering when properly motivated by crisis.